Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope you're having a nice afternoon. It took me a moment to get the link up for the class meeting. Sorry about that. I kind of forgot about it. But we're here now, and I'm so happy that you're with me. Before we get started today, I want to discuss some changes to the syllabus. Now, I've gone ahead and shared the new syllabus in the chat. You can download it from there. You can also find it on Cat Courses. Basically, we just need to bring things in line with where we are in the course. And luckily, we don't need to take anything away. We're going to cover everything that we had planned. We're just going to change some of the dates around. I really just want to draw your attention to the fact that we don't have class on November 25th. And beginning today and through Wednesday, we'll deal with inequality. On Monday of next week, before Thanksgiving, we'll deal with organized crime. And then we'll finish up the class dealing with narcopolitics and US Latin American cooperation. The final paper is going to be due on December 11th. Now, previously I had it due on December, I think, 2nd or 3rd. I want to give you another week because, well, I think that we need it. And with as much that's changed on the ground over the course of the semester, I think it's only fair to give you more space to complete the paper. Now, I do intend to get you feedback on the short paper, and I want to give you plenty of space to finish up the the the, the research paper with that feedback. So I don't want you writing that paper without some sense of how you did on the short paper. And so I intend to get you that feedback in the next week or so, and you should have plenty of space to finish up by December 11th. Now, I want to apologize to you because we don't yet know when the final exam is. For whatever reason, the registrar did not assign a final exam slot to this class. I'm new here, so I don't know if I'm supposed to decide when that is. No one really told me, but I'm trying to figure out when the exam will take place or when it's supposed to take place. And so I apologize. I'm sending emails. I'm waiting to hear back, but for whatever reason, there's a bit of a delay. It's really kind of a strange thing. Maybe I'm missing something, but please bear with me. If for whatever reason there's some like terrible mortal conflict between what you have going on during that period and when the exam takes place that arises because of when we finally found out when that exam takes place, I ask that you just communicate that with me. But I think that for the most part, this should take place at a time when there shouldn't be any conflict, assuming that the course has been assigned that slot, although we don't know about that time just yet. I'm going to check the chat because maybe, no, there will be a final. It's just that for whatever reason, the registrar has us waiting in the wings for when that might be. But I'm going to figure that out as soon as possible. Yeah, I gathered that too, Marcella. But for whatever reason, they didn't give us a date. So we'll deal with that, and we'll figure when that takes place. We'll figure out when that takes place as soon as possible. But this is the rest of the semester for us, and I'm looking forward to it because what we deal with in the rest of the course continues to build on what we know from the first half of the course. And we've all done such a good job that we'll have a lot to work with as we go forward. So I went ahead and shared this syllabus with you in the chat. So please do download a copy of it and refer to it. The readings have not changed. It's just the dates for when we cover certain things have changed a little bit. If there are any questions about this, I'm happy to take those. Does anyone have any questions about the changes? Oh, Sandy, I wish that we didn't have to do an exam. I wish that we could have more fun with it. But alas, we're kind of stuck, I think, at least for now. Does anyone have any comments or questions about the changes? Check the chat here. 80's asking if the final exam will be like the midterm. Um, yes, I expect that it'll be similar, but I'm gonna maintain and kind of retain the right to maybe make some changes. The reason is because I I listened to your feedback after the first exam, and some of you had concerns about the amount of writing and about the format of the exam. And I'm not going to make any promises, but at this point, I am considering some alternative options because I want to make an exam that's tailored to help as many of you as possible. And so when you tell me that something didn't work well for you, I listen, and I want to take that into consideration. So it should be similar, but there may be some changes that result in less writing compared to the midterm. I'm not going to make any promises though, because I'm still considering what format to go with and how best to do this. You will receive a study guide. I think the study guides work well. We'll have that study guide out probably within maybe a week and a half of the exam. I want to give you plenty of space to prepare for the exam, and you seem to really benefit from it last time. I thought that we did a great job on the exam, and I could tell that there was a lot of preparation that went into it as well. So I will give you a study guide. Okay. Yes, only from the last midterm, since the last midterm. It won't be cumulative in any traditional sense. Obviously, some of the stuff that we study from this half of the course kind of requires knowledge from the first half. Um, and I trust that you all have that, but I won't be testing you on like colonial history or something like that. Okay. So make sure that you have a copy of this. Make sure that you're aware of the new deadline for the final paper. We will do kind of like a workshop in the class like we did last time. We probably won't devote as much time to it because you know now sort of the approach that we're taking to this assignment, but we will spend some time in class at some point discussing our ideas. I'm also considering setting up some kind of a peer review where you get an opportunity to exchange your paper or what you have so far with a classmate, and you can work together to kind of provide feedback to each other. That was a suggestion made to me by a student in the class, and I think that that would be useful. Of course, it's up to you if you want to do that. I can't, require any of you to do that, but it could be something that would benefit you if you're looking for some kind of feedback, especially from someone who's doing the same assignment. Maricela, that's an interesting idea. That would be new to me, though, the idea that a course would have tied to it some requirement regarding whether or not there's a final exam. If that's the case, then we won't do one, and I'll rebalance the course according to the assignments that we complete in the first half and the second third. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. That's an interesting hypothesis. Okay, everybody. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get started where we left off. And where we left off was a conversation about corruption. Now, as you can see, we dealt with corruption basically through last week. This week is about inequality, but we're going to finish up that unit on corruption with about 8 or 9 slides, some video, and then a few questions that help us to think about Latin America more generally, using some of the ideas and information that we've picked up through this unit. So we will pick up with inequality later on in today's discussion and lecture, but let's start out with kind of a finisher on the topic of corruption. So bear with me here while I get us set up. Okay, it does this sometimes. Okay, here we go. We're going to start out by watching that video about the Operation Car Wash corruption scandal in Brazil. Now, this is a Vox video, and I think that they do a pretty good job kind of sizing up the issue or the event, but pay a lot of attention to the detail. Who are the people involved? What is the kind of basic nature of the corruption scandal? And then what kinds of transactions took place? And we'll tie this into our discussion as we go forward. But let's go ahead and watch this. It's about 8 or 9 minutes, and then we'll get back together and continue.
This is Comperj, the biggest petrochemical complex in Brazil. It's located in Itaboraí, a small city in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The multi-billion-dollar project launched in 2008, and the plan was to open in 2011. Thousands of Brazilians moved there to work. But it's 2018, and Comperj never opened. Construction of the complex stopped in 2015, after it became a symbol of the largest corruption scandal in Brazil's history, Operation Car Wash. Hundreds of prominent Brazilians, including CEOs, members of Congress, and even a former president have been implicated. Some of Brazil's largest companies lost billions of dollars, and the country slid further into a recession. 4 years since it broke, the scandal is still rippling through Brazil, leaving places like Itaboraí devastated in its wake.
Quando você acha que está indo bem, é aí que você tem que abrir os olhos, porque vai de mal a pior.
Isso tudo nós aqui sabíamos que isso ia acontecer. Uma hora ou outra isso aí ia vir à tona aí, e o que aconteceu foi isso.
Trabalhei 1 ano e 4 meses lá dentro do Comperj e foi a gota d'água, foi quando acabou.
Itaboraí was the perfect place for one of Brazil's most ambitious energy projects. It had the space for 2 refineries and a petrochemical plant, spanning 45 square kilometers. It's also close to Brazil's newly discovered natural gas fields off the coast of Rio and Sao Paulo. When the project launched, it was estimated that Comperj would generate 200,000 direct and indirect jobs in the area. Itaboraí became a boomtown. In 2010, 50,000 people moved there, 160 new businesses opened, and the population grew by over 16%. But 1,200 kilometers away, police broke a case that would doom Comperj. In 2012, they had this gas station in Brasilia under surveillance. They suspected it was being used to launder money. Criminals would bring in illegal cash, report it as gas station earnings, and then funnel the cash to someone else, making the money hard to trace back. The police arrested a known money launderer, Alberto Youssef, and offered him a plea deal in exchange for the source of the money. But he warned his lawyers, "If I speak, the republic is going to fall." Youssef testified that he was laundering money not for criminals, but for top executives at Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil company. Petrobras was the largest oil company in Latin America. It also owned Comperj. The police launched a massive investigation, Operation Car Wash, and soon discovered Petrobras was at the center of an intricate corruption scheme. The company used its projects to enrich criminals, engineering companies, and Brazilian government officials. Here's how it worked in the Comperj project. When Petrobras needed to build the complex, it started a bidding process for the job. Typically, engineering firms would compete for the contract, driving down the price for Petrobras. But a group of these companies got together and formed an agreement. Instead of competing against each other, they cooperated to fix prices and take turns accepting projects. Odebrecht, the biggest firm and ringleader of this cartel, won some of the major contracts to build Comperj. This allowed Odebrecht to overcharge Petrobras and profit immensely. The original cost for Comperj was about $6 billion, but by 2015, Petrobras had paid at least $14 billion. Odebrecht then money laundered some of its profits through outside businesses, like the gas station, before paying bribes to Petrobras executives and politicians. These executives would take the bribes as an incentive to keep giving contracts exclusively to the cartel. Politicians took the bribes in exchange for their influence over Petrobras, like Rio de Janeiro State Governor Sergio Cabral, who received more than $800,000 to give Comperj contracts to a firm in the cartel. This also became an important funding source for their re-election campaigns.
Brazil's Petrobras, one of the world's biggest oil companies, in a heap of trouble.
The company is in the midst of an escalating corruption scandal.
After the scandal broke, Petrobras and the engineering companies were in trouble. Over 24 executives were initially arrested. Compounded by falling oil prices, Petrobras lost half of its stock value between September 2014 and January 2015. Construction on Comperj was incomplete when 13,000 workers were laid off. Today in Itaboraí, 40,000 people are signed up for the city's employment program. An average of 250 people line up here in search of odd jobs.
As pessoas, a maioria, vira à noite sim. Fica aqui para poder garantir a sua vaga aqui. Geralmente aqui é 300, 500 pessoas já teve aqui. Para poder pegar senha. Só que só são 300 senhas distribuídas.
Many of these unemployed residents used to work at Comperj.
Como eu ainda trabalhei lá 2 anos no Comperj, então eu tive muita oportunidade. É um lugar em que você pode até crescer um pouco a sua estabilidade de emprego, entendeu?
Eu vim de Cabo Frio na esperança de trabalhar no Comperj, no polo petroquímico, sendo que já tinham me falado das vagas. Aí eu saí, me mudei, vim morar aqui, né? Hoje sou morador daqui.
The massive layoffs at Comperj affected the rest of the city as well.
Eu fui montar um restaurante lá na entrada do Comperj, na entrada mesmo, na principal do Comperj. E ali, por dia, 400 refeições que vendia. Todo dia, café da manhã, às vezes até janta e tudo. Quando chegou 2013, o Comperj fez isso, só. Parou tudo, restaurante não tinha mais ninguém, começou a ficar deserto.
With Brazil's economy still trying to recover from the recession, Itaboraí has found it hard to bounce back on its own. Today, some limited construction is planned to resume at Comperj after Chinese and Brazilian firms partnered with Petrobras. The natural gas unit is expected to open there in 2020, but this would only create about 5,000 jobs. And the problem is, the closing of Comperj and the devastation of Itaboraí is not an isolated incident. It happened all over Brazil and all over Latin America. Operation Car Wash successfully revealed systemic corruption in Brazil. Car Wash put ex-President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in jail, contributed to the downfall of his successor Dilma Rousseff, and a related investigation has led to her successor, Michel Temer, being charged for corruption. The ex-CEO of Odebrecht was sentenced to 19 years in prison, and Ike Batista, once Brazil's richest man, was sentenced to 30 years. But the same companies were funding major infrastructure projects all over Brazil, so the scandal brought many to an abrupt stop. Like this nuclear power plant in Angra dos Reis, for instance. Like Comperj, it was halted in 2015 because of direct involvement in the car wash scheme. $60 million in bribes were paid out of the project's funding. By 2016, 11 projects were reportedly stalled in Brazil alone. It didn't stop there. The engineering companies involved worked all over Latin America, and in 2016, 17 projects were reportedly stalled in at least 7 countries. Like this irrigation project in Peru, where 3 former presidents have been accused of taking bribes from Odebrecht. In Colombia, this river dredging project was stopped after Odebrecht admitted to paying $11 million in bribes. And in Venezuela, at least 23 infrastructure projects have been suspended. These stalled projects mean lots of layoffs. A report estimates the car wash scandal wiped out 500,000 jobs in Brazil alone. Over 4 years after the scandal broke, Brazil's unemployment is still high. Operation Car Wash is a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's uncovering systemic corruption that has plagued Brazil for decades. But on the other, it's threatening Brazil's democracy. For many, the prosecution of prominent leaders, especially Lula, who was imprisoned at the time when he was leading in the election polls, has revealed a bias in Brazil's judicial system. The elections are now the most divisive in the country's history, with many losing their faith in their political leaders.
Hoje em dia nós não sabe quem é. A pessoa hoje em dia ela vem disfarçada do que ela fez. A pessoa vai procurar e ela não atende.
Okay, so that was about the Operation Car Wash in Brazil. And as you can see, it had an enormous impact. The discovery of that corruption scheme, it shut down dozens and dozens of projects. It resulted in untold layoffs because of just how widely that money had been circulated that was tied up in that corruption scandal. And you see also that these grand corruption schemes reach the very apex of power within a state. We know the example of Lula, his successor, Dilma Rousseff, being impeached in relation to this ongoing corruption scandal, and then even her replacement, Michel Temer, being tied up in this as well. It's pretty astonishing just how immersed the Brazilian political system has been in corruption, especially when it comes to Petrobras, oil companies, construction projects. The Workers' Party in Brazil has been called a very corrupt party because that is a party that has consistently been associated with corruption in the country. And there have been a number of scandals going back many years. And so both Dilma Rousseff and Lula came from the Workers' Party. Now, these consequences that we see in the case of Brazil are also observable in other places like Venezuela, where we see an example of how corruption can undermine governance in the quality of public services or the quality of the public goods provided by a state. A general rule is that countries that are very corrupt tend to provide very poor quality public services. So health, education, utilities, all of these suffer. And a really good example that you might know of is blackouts in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is notorious, especially Caracas, the capital, for suffering from these intermittent blackouts where the utility companies, the power companies have to shut off the power for 12, 24, however many hours at a time in order to conserve energy so that they can remain operational. And these blackouts have become so severe that Caracas in particular loses like dozens of days every year of productivity because of the need to shut the city down and depower the city. But these blackouts are a primary example of corruption because although leaders will say that it's due to the aging infrastructure and some maintenance problems, it's also well known that it has a lot to do with corruption. Whenever bureaucrats and agencies have to get a cut of some total or some money, or if they have to get some part of the dough, the delivery of public services always suffers because you have that many more actors and organizations involved in this scheme, and it slows down the delivery of those services. And so blackouts in Venezuela are a good example because of just how corrupt the place is, and because of how corrupt many of the utilities in state enterprises are. And more generally, in Venezuela and elsewhere, these agencies tend to be very inefficient and very slow for all the reasons I identified. Another consequence of corruption is that it reduces social capital. So this is a term that you've probably heard of before. It's kind of a buzzword. It's not always clear what social capital means. When we use social capital, we're just referring to two things really. On the one hand, the collective value of all social networks, so who people know. And then on the other hand, the tendency of people in these networks to trust one another and to help one another. And so these are what we call norms of reciprocity. So when there's a lot of corruption in a place, it leads to a lot of generalized distrust. People don't trust the police, they don't trust civil servants, they don't trust each other, they don't trust political parties, they don't trust elected leaders, they don't trust virtually anyone they encounter because they expect that that person is trying to corruptly enrich themselves. And in particular, they don't trust the state. This has a negative impact on the tendency of people to value each other and to work together to help each other. And it's really, really detrimental to economic growth, to the kinds of activities that are necessary for like long-term development, trust is essential to long-term partnerships. If trust is absent, if there's an absence of social capital, then it's very difficult to engage in long-term partnerships and long-term investments that require a significant amount of trust in who you're dealing with. It's also the case that you might be less likely to vote or is less likely to go out and participate in politics because you don't believe that elected leaders represent your interest or that they'll respond to you meaningfully. And so there's a way we can look at this. There's not a lot of data about control of corruption and trust, but here is some information that's pretty interesting. We have major Latin American countries: Venezuela, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Argentina. And we have the line of best fit. We've got two variables: control of corruption and political trust. And the line of best fit shows that there's a pretty good relationship between political trust or trust in elected leaders and control of corruption in the country. And so countries like Chile and Uruguay that have more control of corruption on the whole tend to be more trusting of elected leaders, of presidents, legislators, etc. Countries like Venezuela, on the other hand, and maybe Peru or Mexico or Argentina, tend to have lower levels of political trust and lower levels of control of corruption. Now, Venezuela is one exception. It's kind of a deviant case here, but look at, for example, Mexico, Peru, and Argentina. In all three of these cases, relatively little control of corruption, but also relatively low levels of political trust. In a country like Uruguay or Chile, on the other hand, they have better control of corruption and they have more political trust. And so this is the relationship that we see all over the world, but corruption is especially problematic in Latin America. And so data like this becomes especially important because it shows us that trust in democratic institutions declines as corruption increases. And this relates closely to the fifth consequence of corruption, which is that corruption erodes democracy. Now, the intuitive logic here is just that democratic leaders are supposed to pursue the public interest, but corruption by definition erodes the rule of law, it undermines accountability, it decreases trust in leaders and institutions in the ways that I discussed, and it creates a risk of political instability. All of these things undermine democracy, and it makes it more difficult to have free and fair and frequent elections and to promote civil rights and civil liberties. It makes it difficult to have a democratic society when that society is awash in corruption. And this connects to the point made in the video that we just watched, which is that in Brazil, democracy is being undermined by corruption, not just because of the replacement of impeached presidents with appointed presidents, not just because of the loss of legitimacy of political leaders, but also because people are no longer believing in democracy itself. They don't believe that democratic institutions have the capacity to really respond meaningfully to them if there's no accountability and if corruption is so rife. And so in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America, corruption is a serious problem, not just economically, but also politically. At this point, you may be asking, well, do people fight back? What is it there that can be done? And I want to show you a couple videos of some news footage that does highlight the capacity of masses and publics to fight back and to respond and to challenge corruption in their own way. And so we're going to take a look at both Guatemala and Argentina. And so give me a moment here while I get this going.
Thousands of people take to the streets of Guatemala City to protest their president. The demonstration is led by subsistence farmers and indigenous organizations. This is the third consecutive day they've rallied together in different parts of the country. They're calling for President Jimmy Morales to reverse his decision to force out an international anti-corruption group when its mandate expires next year, and a ban to prevent the group's leader, Ivan Velasquez, from returning to the country.
The only thing Jimmy Morales and his party's congressmen are doing is protecting themselves and protecting corruption, because they're definitely corrupt and they will go to jail. So they're doing everything they can to get rid of CICIG and not be investigated.
Since starting in 2006, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, or CICIG, has helped public prosecutors jail ex-presidents, congressmen, and drug traffickers, earning praise from governments around the world. Last year, the commission started investigating Morales and his family for alleged corruption and called for his impeachment. Morales, a former comedian, denies any wrongdoing. Backed by the army, he announced on August 31st that CICIG is highly politicized and has overstepped its remit.
Last year, the United Nations Secretary General was made aware of the many concerns that the Guatemalan state had with the responsibilities of the Commission, with many members of its team violating our laws, enticing people and institutions to participate in acts that are corrupt and of impunity.
CICIG's critics say Guatemala's sovereignty is under attack.
Out of more than 190 countries, the only one in the world with a CICIG is Guatemala, and it hasn't worked. It was a failed United Nations experiment. If we analyze it, we see the main problem was trying to impose an organization that was above the law.
But most political analysts say that their work, which has continued in spite of this crisis, is essential.
During these 11 or 12 years of work, CICIG has laid bare the existence of illegal clandestine security groups. And over the past 3 years, the Public Prosecutor's Office, with technical help from CICIG, have weakened these actors and the ways they can operate.
While Guatemalans wait for the nation's top court to decide whether the president's actions are legal, these protesters have already made up their minds.
Organizers say that the street protest will continue until the president and his cabinet step down. But Jimmy Morales shows no signs of wavering, and that could mean that this political crisis will be heating up. David Mercer, Al Jazeera, in Guatemala City.
So that was the Guatemalan case. And what's interesting about the Guatemalan case is we know that Guatemala has descended into dictatorship under Jimmy Morales. And partly because of his decision to basically bar an opposition candidate who was associated with that corruption probe, who had been part of leading that corruption probe. And so the situation in Guatemala doesn't just illustrate the protests and the dissatisfaction with corruption, but also how politics and power struggles become part of the picture too. And so the regime and the democracy in Guatemala are really under threat, and the situation is closely related to corruption. Now here's the situation in Argentina in 2012. Now this was a protest against Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, who was then the president in Argentina. Argentina is another Latin American country that historically and still today has relatively high levels of corruption. And in this case, Fernandez Kirchner was the target of these protests, which were also very, very huge. Now, what's interesting about this situation is that when I was living in Buenos Aires, I actually met some people and hung out one day on the rooftop of a building where at the time, President Cristina Hernandez Kirchner had an apartment. And the day before I hung out with those people on that rooftop in 2018, the federal police had actually raided her apartment as part of this ongoing corruption investigation that stemmed from this 2012 set of events that people were protesting. And so it really, really interesting. And it was in Recoleta, which is the part of the city where all the best and priciest real estate is located. So it wasn't surprising that it would be the apartment of the former president. But it was pretty astonishing that the day before, the federal police had raided that apartment as part of a corruption scandal. And so that was eye-opening. But in Argentina, corruption is a big problem, and they haven't had much success addressing it with institutional solutions like the creation of an anti-corruption body, partly because of some of the ways that political parties use corruption, especially. And the situation in Guatemala is somewhat like it is in Argentina, in that corruption is high in both countries. The difference, however, is that in Argentina, the democracy remains intact, and corruption is a problem, but it hasn't had quite the political consequence that it has in Guatemala. Okay, so these protests against corruption are really inspiring because they show us that although corruption is carried out by elites, and although grand corruption is something that happens on a much higher stage, publics and societies can fight back and do fight back. And more generally, there is a lot of opposition to corrupt officials and to corruption. A lot of it comes from the international community and local non-governmental organizations that push for specific kinds of reforms. And in some cases, there's also an important role for journalists and people in civil society who can expose wrongdoing. So in Chile, for example, when I was there studying the defense industry, I was supposed to meet some people, some journalists who had done some investigative work uncovering corruption in the military and its connection to an export tax that would set aside huge sums of money for the military kind of under the table every year. And this is an example of the role of journalists, but also non-governmental organizations. The international community more generally cares a lot about corruption because the reasons that I identified, it's possible that corruption can create political uncertainty. It undermines development, and it sort of misappropriates and wastes a lot of money and resources and talent, and it sucks the life out of investments. The investments could be the investments of multinational corporations or groups that are based elsewhere that have a stake somewhere in Latin America. So it's not just these countries that have an interest in reducing corruption, it's also the international community as a whole. And the reform process itself really has 3 steps. And I want you to focus on these 3 steps and think about these 3 steps, because in a moment I'm going to ask you about where we think Latin America is in this sequence. But the first step involves creating a constituency for change, creating a political movement for change, organizing people in a way that can serve the cause of reducing corruption. That means creating protest movements. That means organizing social movements or unions and uniting them behind the cause of protesting or combating corruption. It means using existing sources of social power, right? Whichever forms they may take. Creating a constituency for change begins at the grassroots. These elites are not going to reform themselves, so it has to begin in society. But in society, those groups eventually connect themselves to parties and power brokers who have the capacity to make the actual changes in the institutions of society that would lead to reducing corruption. And so the second step is making institutional reforms. This is changing the institutions or the arrangements in the society, in the political system, in a way that can help to reduce corruption, creating anti-corruption bodies, creating accountability mechanisms like monitors or various authorities of the state that are independent and that are charged with assessing or auditing the behavior and the accounts of public institutions, and so on and so forth. And then the third step is actually using those institutions to increase accountability. This is where those anti-corruption bodies and those auditors and those monitors become important, because it's not enough to just have those institutions. They actually have to use their power to hold powerful actors accountable. And that means, like what happened in Guatemala, you press charges, you prosecute, you identify the wrongdoers, and you hold them accountable in a very material way. These are the 3 steps in reducing corruption. And all 3 of these steps are important because, well, one has to be taken before the next and so on. But what I want to ask you is, based on everything that we've seen, that we've read about so far in the course, that we read about for this unit, that we saw in the video footage, that we saw in the pictures, where are Latin American countries today in this sequence? And then more generally, how many steps have Latin American countries completed? Where do you think we are in this process?
Well, if I remember correctly, in the case of Argentina, there were constituencies that were created for fighting corruption in the country. However, those weren't having an impact. So I think that would be step 3 is the one that at least Argentina is currently at.
Okay, do you think that Argentina has completed step 3, Ishan?
No, because I think you touched on it last week that those measures that are being taken by that particular department are ineffective and or not creating change within the Argentine community.
Okay, good. So that's certainly a reflection on the Argentine case that sounds pretty on point. But let's discuss this further. Can we think of other examples? Are there other perspectives? Are there other countries that we've studied that you think we can pinpoint in this sequence?
I'll say for Mexico, as in step 2, we're making institutional reforms. As an example, under AMLO presidency, he has established the National Guard to fight against corruption or any sort of corruption against the narcos or any other corruption things happening.
So, Abel, so that's a pretty new change then. That came pretty recently then.
Yeah, pretty recently.
Do you think that it was difficult to create that constituency for change in Mexico, or did that come pretty naturally?
I think, I don't know, it just depends on how you see it, because on the majority of people, they see this corruption, they know that it's happening, but it's kind of difficult to get these people accountable for, because they're part of this the people themselves are part of this circles of corruption too.
Yeah, and so one thing about Mexican politics that stands out is that some of the political parties pay voters for their support, for their vote, and there are a lot of poor people in Mexico, and so a lot of Mexicans rely on that money, or they need that money, and so it's difficult for them to support ending a system that they kind of depend on or that they're a part of themselves. And that's one of the challenges of combating corruption. When petty corruption is a part of everyday life, it becomes more difficult to stop grand corruption. And so the PRI, the Institutional Revolution Party, which emerged from the Mexican Revolution in 1917, it held on to power for most of the 20th century, mainly because it was able to rig elections through clientelist practices where they would pay voters or where they would control the electoral roll. And so in Mexico, a lot like in Argentina, voters sometimes benefit a lot from the system of corruption, especially if they're poor or if they're in a situation where they've come to rely on or they've become enmeshed in this kind of clientelistic relationship with the political party. So in Argentina, the main party that does that is the Peronist Party. That's a classic sort of populist, labor-centered party that has a close connection with poor working class people and lower working or middle class people, especially in urban centers in Buenos Aires. And so they've developed that constituency over the years through these clientelistic practices, these patron-client relationships that are essentially corrupt relationships where they pay voters for their support.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much for sharing that about. Christian says, I'd wager some in 1 and some in 2. We see countries like Chile in the process of step 2 as we speak, but others are still fighting for the creation of institutional reform. Yeah, and so like what was said in the video about Guatemala, the Anti-Corruption Commission in Guatemala, even though it was basically shut down or curbed by Jimmy Morales, that was a unique institution because it doesn't always exist everywhere in the world. And in Latin American countries, these anti-corruption bodies aren't super common. And so a lot of countries are still trying to make those reforms. And the case of Chile is an interesting one because I think Christian's right. I think Chile is at about step 2. I would actually wager that maybe they might even be between step 1 and step 2 because there's less corruption in Chile. And so there's been less of a political incentive or need to address it. It does exist in the military. And I've actually written about institutions that contribute to corruption in the military. And they've had some success in reforming those types of institutions. But on the whole, they still haven't created institutions that are designed specifically to address corruption. And that might be because there's less of a problem. But the trap might be not addressing the corruption that does exist because there seems to be more of it elsewhere, and then falling into the trap of not addressing it at all. Maricela says, I would say that Brazil was in step 3, but then a classmate mentioned that the plant reopened. So I would say that they went back to step 1 because they have to start all over and make sure that those in charge of the plant don't do the same thing as the previous people that ran the plant. So that's an interesting point, Maricela. I think that what Christian was pointing out was that there might have been a new investment from some other company. It's possible that some multinational made that investment and the project has shifted, and maybe the financing is coming from somewhere else. I would doubt that the plant reopened under the auspices of the same set of relationships that were corrupted by the previous situation. It's probably the case that there was a new investment of some kind that helped save the day, so to speak. But I would agree with you if your general point is that, you know, in Brazil, corruption remains a problem. And anytime you have these big state-owned natural resource producers, these big firms like Petrobras, you create an opportunity for corruption because there's a lot of what we call lootable wealth. Remember that on Monday of last week, I discussed this concept, this notion of lootable wealth. Anytime we have a lot of natural resources, and especially when the state controls those, well, there's a lot of money just kind of sloshing around in the state accounts. And that money can be misappropriated very, very easily by powerful actors who are not fully accountable to democratic society. And so in the case of Military Gate in Chile, remember that I told you that one reason it became possible was because the military every year was getting these huge transfers of billions of US dollars, and that these transfers were all off budget, and that both the legislature and the executive could not examine or know how large the transfer sum was. The only way that they could ever find out how much money was transferred that given year was by examining the balance sheet of the copper company that had to transfer the money after the fact. And so in Chile, you had these military officers who were in charge of figuring out what to do with this enormous slush fund of billions of dollars. Well, surprise, surprise, some of them began running off with some of the money, and they set up a corruption scheme that involved using fake invoices to line their pockets and run away with huge sums. And so this is what we call lootable wealth. You know, in Mexico, in Brazil especially, there's a lot of oil. And that means then that there's a lot of lootable wealth. Same in Venezuela. There's a lot of lootable wealth, a lot of money just sloshing around in the state when the accountability mechanisms are insufficient to actually rein in or control actors, they often end up running away with it. And maybe it's a cynical way of viewing humans, but the fact is, this is often what happens when we don't have devices in place to control them and control their behavior. Deleanor says, I think the poverty in these countries make it hard to uproot all corruption. I don't believe they can eliminate all corruption. Look at the United States and our now former President Trump. Yeah, no kidding, right? And it's in the wide open, isn't it, Deleanor? The receiving of payments from foreign governments, the systematic use of his golf courses in the Secret Service to enrich himself on our dime. Absolutely, without a doubt. And I think that what Deleanor highlights is that it's almost kind of part of the behavior of politicians. And not saying that all politicians are corrupt, but if it's possible, you often eventually see it. You see this kind of theft. You see this kind of behavior. And so, if I were to answer this question, I think that Latin American countries on the whole are at about step 2. Most of these countries are trying to sort of mobilize the political support to push through institutional changes. They have not completed step 2. In many cases, they've proposed reforms and they have support in society. They have some constituency, but in many cases, they've yet to approve or push through these changes. Some countries are going to be at step 3. Countries like Argentina, where they've made the reforms, but they haven't successfully held accountable those key actors who are most likely to become corrupted. But on the whole, countries are at step 2. And so this is where we are in Latin America on the whole. And some countries might be at step 3 or step 1. Some countries might be done with the process. Countries like Uruguay, for example, might be nearly done. But I think that even then, we would want to look closely because there might be patterns that we wouldn't expect to see. Okay, so we're going to shift our attention and begin a new unit. And this is going to be about the politics of inequality in Latin America. Now, this gets us into some economic factors that we haven't talked about that much in the class. But one of the key themes that comes up in this unit that you're already very familiar with is the middle class. You know already that in Latin America, the middle class is bigger than ever before, and that cities in particular are thriving hubs of activity where large middle classes are populated and where unions and large organizations have taken root and become very powerful and very influential over the years. When we talk about inequality, we're going to be talking a lot about the middle class and the role of the middle class in society and in politics. Today, and at the start of Wednesday's lecture, we'll primarily be talking about what inequality is and some of the direct consequences of it, before we eventually have a more detailed discussion about the causes of inequality and about how we can understand it systematically and how we can understand some of the variation that we observe between Latin American countries. So we're going to be discussing then really 3 key components of this topic. And that is, first, inequality in the middle class. Second, different perspectives on inequality. And then thirdly, we'll discuss the case of Brazil. And we're going to be using Brazil as kind of like a case, kind of an insight case throughout this discussion. And the reason is because Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. And this is both the case sort of economically and in terms of income, but also spatially. Many of you have maybe seen these iconic or these depressing images of the inequalities in Brazilian cities and the spatial inequality between the favelas, or the sort of poor neighborhoods as they're called in Brazil, favelas, and the rich areas of the cities that are notable for how abundant they are and how opulent they are in comparison to the favelas. We'll be discussing Brazil throughout this discussion in this lecture, and it'll give us a good chance to see how some of these themes and concepts exhibit themselves in the real world. Now, before we continue, let me take a look at the chat here. Okay, so we're gonna have some fun here. I wanna create a poll. So give me just a moment here. Okay, I'm almost done here. Okay. Now, I have launched a poll. So if you go to polling and bring it up, you'll see the poll that I've given you. I'm asking you, when you look at this list of statements, what do all of these statements have in common? And I want you to answer whether all of them are true or all of them are false. And we'll take some time to look at this and kind of think about it. But this is anonymous, so there's no fear. And jump into this because we'll discuss each of these here in a moment when we get back together. I'm so happy to see us getting so many replies.
I think that all four statements are true because as you just demonstrated on the previous slide, the spatial inequality is very visible. So that leads me to believe that there's significant inequality in Latin America. However, I think that the Latin American middle class is on the rise. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the middle class is becoming more wealthy.
Okay, good reasoning. I like what Ishan's doing here. Let's just jump into it. As we continue to vote, does anyone else want to suggest or talk about their reasoning or what they responded with? Take another moment here while people dial in and respond to the poll. Thank you so much, everyone who's already participated. I'm happy to see so much turnout.
May you explain number 3 a little bit more? I'm kind of confused as to exactly what it's trying to say.
Yeah, so what this is saying is that policymakers and the international community argue that the inequality undermines economic growth. Yes or no? In other words, do they see it as good or bad for the economy?
And what about the democratic consolidation? What does that have to do?
So that means just that policymakers in the international community see inequality as making it harder to solidify or grow democracies.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. We're just about done here. Only 2 more folks need to respond, and now we've only got 1 more. Almost all votes are in. Well, this is really fun. I'm glad that we did this. We've got 1 more out there. If you out there have yet to vote, we'd love to hear from you. But we got such good turnout that I think that it's probably sufficient. So before we continue, does anyone else want to talk a little bit about what they said and why? Can anyone talk about why they maybe put down false?
For me, number one, I'm not, I'm not, I don't truly believe it has the highest inequality rate of any region in the world. Um, I'm thinking maybe like a place like South Africa may have more inequality, or maybe similar to Brazil. But I don't believe it might have the highest inequality of any region in the world.
Okay, okay. So that's the one that does maybe seem like it could be in dispute, right? Is it true that Latin America has the highest inequality of any region in the world? Does anyone else want to comment on that question or that possibility? That is an interesting question. What did the rest of you all think?
Yeah, Professor. So for that, I want to comment that let's take Mexico as an example. Mexico has the highest inequality I can think of in Latin America because not only is one of the wealthiest men in the world living there, but it's also one of the nations where if you go out to the streets, you can see people that are living on the streets and don't have enough to survive on a daily basis. So it's visible. I believe this man used to be the wealthiest in the world at one point. Carlos Slim.
Yeah, that's the guy.
So that's why I believe that Latin America has the highest inequality.
Yeah, and you know what? Jose makes a fantastic point, which is that one thing about Latin American countries like Mexico that makes them different than many African countries is that in Mexico you have some really, really rich people, like really rich people, like people who bought up all the utility companies when they were privatized. And we're talking about big industries that don't really exist in most African countries. So don't forget that Latin American countries are usually pretty well developed economically. And so that means it's possible to have these really, really rich people, but also these really poor people, who have to work in the streets, right? And sell things in the informal sector of the economy without any protections or um, uh, any sort of protection that they would normally experience if they had like a regular job. In a lot of African countries, they don't have industrialized economies. And so, yeah, we can imagine that there might be some rich people there, but those rich people can't get rich from like the same ways that you might get rich if you're a Mexican business person or something like that, where the economy is more developed and you can maybe buy up these big companies that are privatized by the state. And so what I want to tell you is that all four of these are true. Now, there may be some disbelievers out there. Some of you may be skeptical. Latin America does have the highest inequality of any region in the world, and it has to do with the reasons that we just discussed. Countries like Chile, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, these countries were early developers. That means that they industrialized relatively early on compared to other parts of the developing world. If we're comparing those countries to, say, African countries, well, in African countries, a lot of that industrialization is taking place now, or it hasn't happened yet. And so even a country like Botswana developed economically, so to speak, decades after Argentina or Chile or Mexico did. And so what that means then is you just have a lot more capital accumulated in a place like Chile or Mexico compared to the population of the place. What that means in turn is that you do have the possibility of getting these really rich people, but we also have these really poor people because the political systems in these societies have not worked very well to redistribute the income and the wealth generated by the society. And so you have these really rich people like Carlos Slim, but you also have these really poor people like oftentimes indigenous people, women, LGBTQT people, other minorities who usually disproportionately suffer and are usually the ones who bear the brunt of poverty. And so Latin America has the advantage of being a place that is both industrialized, but also the disadvantage of being a place that has a smaller middle class compared to more industrialized and more developed democracies like the United States or those in Western Europe. Marcella says, I think sometimes when we think of equality, we think of everyone having equal access to resources, but it also has to do with what the government does to address those inequalities or to better support those that really need it. Absolutely, Marcella. And the thing is that when we talk about inequality, we're talking about the distribution of income and wealth. That is the distribution of what's already been created. And so even if everyone has what's supposed to be equal access, the system itself produces unequal outcomes. And then those unequal outcomes make it difficult to say that everyone has equal access, because those unequal outcomes then sort of remake the playing field. And so, as Marcella adds, the ones who suffer the most are the children. Deleonore, tell me in the chat, which question do you like? I'd be happy to consider that. But this high level of inequality is extraordinary, not just because it sets Latin America apart, but because it has survived more than 30 years of democratic politics. So in Latin American countries, transitions to democracy brought high hopes that there would be an improvement in the living standards of poor and lower working and middle class people, and that there'd be a narrowing of the gap. But in a lot of countries that hasn't happened, and democratic governments have often been incapable of redistributing income, especially and including leftist governments who ruled most countries in the region for the 90s and the 2000s, but were usually unable to make much of a dent in the inequality. The third point is just as important. Latin American inequality is of interest to policymakers, but also the international community. They argue that investment in the region will always suffer because of inequality and the perception of risk that is associated with it. Democracies themselves remain unstable, partly because of inequality. Those of you who are keeping track of what's happening in Peru, maybe you know, for example, that more than half of the legislators in the Congress that just impeached Vizcarra are themselves under investigation for corruption. So democratic consolidation suffers when corruption is a serious problem. And then finally, it is true that the Latin American middle class is getting larger and larger, but inequality is declining relatively slowly because the elites in the powerful rich in Latin America are themselves getting richer at a relatively quick pace as well. And so inequality is not falling as quickly as maybe we would like. And inequality remains a challenge in Latin American countries. Okay, Deleonore, I'll consider that. No promises, but I always enjoy your input and I want to know what you like. Listen, everybody, this was a good start for today. I want you to think about inequality, and when we come back on Wednesday, we'll discuss this further. We'll unravel this and have a more engaging conversation that involves talking about some country experiences, talking about Brazil, and also involves some footage. So thank you very much for being here today, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Bell.
Have a good night.
You too.
Also, continue to do polls. It's really helpful a lot when it comes to that.
Great. Good to know.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Have a good one.